Okay, we're going to start looking at Chapter 10, Part 2. I've done some changes to the size of the video on the recommendation of a student who shall remain nameless. So let's see if this actually works out. Cross your fingers. In this section, we're going to start looking at tropical rainforests, preserves, and national parks and see the history of those and their outlook for the future. So let us begin by looking at tropical deforestation. And if you take a look, you can see here on the left side, in 1975, there was, pretty lush rainforest here in Brazil. And in that same area, it has been developed tremendously. And, for various reasons, which we're going to look at. And some of them are because of things that you do. So there's a huge amount of the biodiversity that exists in tropical rainforests. And we're burning these areas away in order to make way for crops and cattle ranches and a lot of urban development as these countries become more developed. And also as our demand for certain crops increases, these countries that recognize they can make a substantial amount of money just by deforesting areas for croplands. And so here are some numbers about tropical rainforests, how much they cover of the Earth's land surface. So that's about as much as the lower part of the 48 United States, obviously excluding Hawaii and Alaska. And that used to be 2 times that at one point. And most of that destruction, sadly, has occurred since the 1950s. And what we are doing now is definitely not going to stop it. So something needs to change, or we are going to see most of the rainforests go and all the species within those rainforests disappear. So we need to do something as a country and as individuals and as cities and as schools and everything else in order to make sure that there is some conservation. We're going to look at some really hot spot areas, and that's a big word you're going to hear a lot is hot spots, Brazil in particular. But Africa has a substantial amount of rainforest as well, and so do areas in Southeast Asia like Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Burma, and countries like those. And so here are some numbers relating to Brazil data, and we're going to focus on Brazil because a lot of research has been done there, and we can see that they are clearing this out at an amazing rate, an 11 football fields a minute in a study done, I believe, in 2002. And so between 1970 and 2005, of the coastal rainforest, 93% has been cleared. And that was 2005. That was 10 years ago, or close to 10 years ago, and now that it's 2015. So that's almost the size of Europe, and species are being lost quickly. And so something needs to be done in order for us to save this area. You can look to find out some global information on page 205 in your book, and it will give you an outlook for the planet as a whole and not just Brazil. So there are some things we need to worry about when we clear out rainforests, and one thing that we know is that they are a substantial source of medicinal plants, and a lot of the medicines that we use today come from plants originally discovered by indigenous people. And so here's a list of some, and I'll flip through them. You can take a look. This plant helps with high blood pressure, something I need. A plant solution for ovarian cancer. For malaria treatment, quinine is used worldwide for malaria treatment. It's saved millions of lives. So here's some interesting facts as we're staring at this last one. 9 of the 10 leading prescription drugs originally came from wild organisms, not necessarily plants, but for the most part plants. And there's about 3,000 plants identified by the National Cancer Institute as helping to fight cancer. They have cancer-fighting chemicals within them. About 2,100 of them come from tropical rainforests. So as we degrade this rainforest, we're also degrading our possibilities of finding solutions to diseases that we have, and some diseases that we will see in the future. So, and a lot of these species of plants are not known. They do not have names. They've never been discovered, and they will be extinct before they ever are discovered. So something needs to happen. Okay, so what are the causes of tropical forest degradation? And, with things like mining and logging, the production of dams is an interesting source of destruction because, when you stop a river flow, it's going to form a large lake, and that will definitely creep out and destroy rainforest. But food production is a thing that we need to worry about, and we have a high demand for food, and in the United States we like cheap food, and in order to get cheap food we tend to import that from countries that can produce it cheaply, namely Brazil and places like that. And so they are cutting down their rainforest at that alarming rate to supply the demand for cheap food by the United States. And interestingly, there was in the past a problem with the company McDonald's, who has been accused of using cheaply imported beef, and they have since claimed to change that plan, but some other things have popped up in recent times. But with pressure from consumers, McDonald's has changed their policies, and that's a part of something that we can do by how we put pressure on these companies. And there's other causes. Poverty is obviously a cause of deforestation, because in order to generate funds, in order to produce income, people will do what they need to do to survive. Population growth is definitely something that happens and spreads out into the tropical rainforest. So here are some solutions, and I'll let you read this. And interestingly, some I think might be better than others, and you could take a look and decide for yourself. There's a difference, though, between prevention and restoration. Obviously, prevention keeps the rainforest intact before any damage can be done, and restoration, obviously, is the rehabilitation of areas that have been destroyed. All right, why don't you press pause right now and answer these questions on your paper. I'll give you a second here. There are some heroes of rainforest preservation, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce this person's name. I don't know it too well. But she actually won a Nobel Prize in 2004, and many people have never even heard of her, and we'll learn a little bit about her in class, but her efforts have been tremendous in preserving rainforest in her native country, Kenya. Okay, so here are some ideas to manage and sustain grasslands. So since most of the world's livestock is running around on rangelands and grasslands, there are some things that can be done. So we can obviously limit the number of livestock and how they're distributed on land. So my question to that is, how exactly do we control the number of livestock with an increasing demand, especially for the demand of cheap beef? Now keep in mind, you can run to Jim's Burger across the street, or of a Boulevard Burger across the street, get a 99-cent hamburger, and an organic apple would cost you more than that. So it's kind of strange, how cheaply we can produce food. It really boils down to how you want to spend your money and what is important to you. And being so far from these areas that are being destroyed, it doesn't really seem like there's a connection, but there definitely is a direct connection on how we spend our money and the way rainforests are being preserved. And we see that overgrazing is obviously something that can destroy the grassland areas, because the carrying capacity cannot withstand the number of cattle that are running through there. And one thing that people do not also consider is that when you have thousands of cattle stepping on the same area over and over and over, it compacts the soil and makes it impossible for seed to even penetrate to start to grow. So it'll turn an area that had soft soil into very hard, compacted, almost like clay, and that becomes difficult for plants to grow. And here's an area that has been restored, and this is in Arizona. What we see here is that the cattle have, on the left side, have completely cleared out this area, but by limiting the amount of cattle that can come through, and also off-road vehicles, and we were talking about that before, motorcycles and quad racers or whatever they're called, and just any kind of off-road vehicle, mountain bikes even as well, will compact the soil and make it impossible for plants to grow. So limiting all of that has done tremendous things. And so there's a problem that people have been moving to the Southwest at an amazing rate. And unfortunately, what that means is they need housing, and that's coming from ranches and areas like that. And we're finding that ranches are declining in place of condos to house these people that are coming in from all over the country. So things have been done. They are paying ranchers easements to help them offset the cost of not developing, and the government is rezoning areas to prevent development. And so neither of those is the absolute solution, and some people like one more than the other, or some people don't like either of those. And so we have to decide, what is best for the area and what we are willing to do. Oh, look at that magic. Now there are question numbers. You can answer these on your paper. Press pause at this moment and work out some solutions to these. Okay, now we're going to get into some really interesting facts and some positive things, and let's take a look at national parks. So the national park system was established by Theodore Roosevelt. He was the 26th and youngest president at the time, and he was a Republican, and he did some tremendous things for preservation in the United States. And so I'm going to move on to this next slide. It's got a paragraph here about him. Kind of summarizes what he's done. Press pause and give this a read. Okay, so not only the United States, but many countries have now established national parks, and there's more than 1,100 at this point. But these are all threatened by human activity. Local people still poach land or poach animals and wood. Loggers are getting in there as well. Sometimes the parks are just too small to sustain large species, and there's a problem with invasive species. And one thing that we were talking about also with small areas is what happens when the area is too small to keep genetic diversity from existing, and so you start getting inbreeding with small populations of organisms, and that can degrade the genetic viability of that species. So taking a look at national parks, one thing that's happened with national parks is that they're being overused. People are rushing in tremendous amounts. That causes air pollution. And I think the book limits it to air pollution, but I think at the same time, we know from the things that we've been talking about that there's sound pollution as well as light pollution as well. There are also inholdings within national parks, and those are privately held lands that were not used to produce the park. And so these lands are being developed by people to produce things like housing and condos and all these other things. So that can also be a problem. Here's a list of solutions, and there's a couple things that I thought were interesting in looking at this list, and one is obviously to buy those inholdings. That could definitely stop inholdings if they were just owned by the government. And you could limit the number of visitors to the crowded park areas and raise the entry fee, which would also limit those. So you can take a look at those for yourself and see what you think would be the best solution. All right, here are some questions for you to answer on your paper. Press pause and work these out. Again, remember, some of these have no correct answer, and it's just what do you think. And so your opinion matters, and I would definitely like to hear what you have to say. Different than national parks are reserves and preserves, and these are areas that are established solely for nature to reestablish itself. And so we even in the Los Angeles area, we have some here, and we'll take a look at some of those in a moment. So take a look at what the ecologists have done. So they have made this call to government in order to save these lands for biodiversity to exist. And here's some numbers, and you can take a look at those. Again, there is that call for full protection, is what we were asking in class the other day. Should biodiversity take precedence over economic values? And in some areas people are trying to establish that as yes. So you don't need to answer this on your paper, but take a look and be prepared to talk about it in class. One country that's become a model for preservation is Costa Rica, and Costa Rica has a huge boom in ecotourism. And ecotourism is tourism that focuses on the ecology, the natural ecology of whatever the area is. In this case, it's rainforest, Costa Rica being tropical. And millions of people come to Costa Rica to travel through the rainforest, and a lot of it is done in a very sustainable way, so people can't go trampling through the rainforest and destroy it on foot. And zip lining is something that there is a lot of, and we'll take a look at some videos in class. But look at the sheer magnitude of preserve and reserve that is established in Costa Rica, and they're making a huge economic value from it. So we call it a non-use value, but in this case for Costa Rica, it has become a use value. Here's a little zoom in. So here is a model for some of the reserves, and they have the core area in the center with buffer zones around the outside, and those buffer zones are to keep people obviously able to look at these natural areas, but to preserve that core area for biodiversity. Hopefully those core areas are large enough to maintain the genetic diversity that the species need in order to maintain their overall fitness. Because again, like with fragmentation, if the area is too small, the organisms will not be able to maintain that. This is a map of local preserves that we see here in Los Angeles County. And there's a number of preserves in Los Angeles County, but I am focusing on these because this is where I tend to go hike around. And these are off of the 60 freeway in the Puente Hills area, and between Whittier and La Habra Heights. And there's a lot of hiking that occurs through here. And when you go through here, it doesn't look like much because people expect to see forest. And again, this is Chaparral, and Chaparral does not have the same amount of tree area, but there are many organisms that depend on these areas, and migrating species as well. So take a look at this map and you get an idea of where it is. And there's a zoom in again on that model biosphere reserve. Oops, I got my map right here. Okay. Mapping is important in order to develop reserves that are going to be functional for species, and it limits fragmentation when done appropriately. Also, you can monitor the distribution of species within the area, but if you take a look, and let me zoom in here. We have two areas, the Powder Canyon on this side and this different preserve here, the Puente Hills Reserve, and there is not enough connection here between these two. At one point these were connected, but now there's been a substantial amount of development in between these two areas. So species that are going to migrate here have to come across some major highways, and there's nothing here for them to go under or over in order to migrate between these two areas. Now obviously things like butterflies and birds have no problem, but different organisms, coyotes and raccoons and possibly even mountain lion and deer are not going to be able to migrate between these two areas, and it leaves fragmentation as a possible problem. So we can focus on hotspots, and there's that word again, hotspots. And when we take a look at the next slide, we'll see a map of these hotspots and where they are in the world. And these are areas that have a large amount of existing biodiversity. Keep in mind that these hotspots were larger at one point, but now they have been significantly decreased. But conservation efforts have been done, in order to make a lot of these reserves and also maintain the economy of the local areas, like Costa Rica, who's turned it into a huge part of their economy. So here are these hotspots. Notice that one of these hotspots is right here along the west coast of the United States and into parts of Mexico. And so what we have done, we have tremendously developed this Southern California area here. If you notice, you can start from the north end of the valley and go all the way down to San Diego, and it's almost a constant flow of cement. That's definitely a problem, and we're trying to keep that from happening in other countries, make the same mistakes that we have. So in order to have these reserves, we need to set aside wilderness land, and a very small percentage has been done so far. And wilderness land, once it's gone, it will not come back, or be very difficult to get it to come back, just because the species that get removed have a difficult time reestablishing themselves. So in order to do that, the best thing to do would be to set it aside originally as wilderness area and reserve, in order to focus on preservation and not that emphasis on restoration. Here are some words. Take a look at these. Okay, here is the 5 basic science-based principles for ecological restoration. And I don't need to read these to you. You can read them for yourself. We're going to look at these 5 principles in class and try to identify the obstacles for these to happen. And there are many, and your ideas are always very unique and interesting, and you guys come up with things that I would never have thought of. So, it's as a group, we're all able to have input here. Interestingly, the book throws out the idea that being able to restore areas will encourage people to destroy other areas, because they will then think that they can just restore them again later. So if we deforest an entire area, it's not going to be too destructive, because we will be able to restore it later. And that is, I think, flawed thinking from my perspective, and I think that prevention is probably the best way to go. It is definitely cheaper than restoration, so maybe the economic shift isn't actually going to be that great. Up front, there will be a tremendous amount of income, but in the end, not too much. Here's something to think about. Should we mount a massive effort to restore ecosystems we have degraded, even though this will be quite costly? And I think now that you guys are in the high school area, the high school part of life, you can already see where money gets wasted in other areas. And maybe if we had a better understanding of how to spend money, we could offset some of that and use it for restoration of ecosystems. So what can we do? And there's the list of things that we can do right now. You can take action now. Obviously, that's the most important thing. We have to stop what we're doing immediately, especially with that destruction of rainforest in Brazil at the rate at which it's occurring. Old growth can never be returned, so we definitely need to protect old growth. And we need to map where this remaining biodiversity is. And there have been great efforts in California to map where that old growth is, and they've identified some of the oldest and tallest trees in the redwood forest and the southernmost old growth redwood trees. We need to identify those marine hot spots because the ocean is tremendously unmapped, and we don't know what kind of destruction we are occurring in areas that have not been studied too well. So we can see some areas, and we'll focus on some marine destruction, such as the large amount of plastic that's accumulating in the Pacific, and we can see what that's doing to species such as the cormorant, which is a marine bird. And we need to focus on lakes and rivers, which is something that we don't do, and especially here in California, we don't know too much about lakes and rivers. Our river, being the LA River, is already gone, and we're going to take a look at that as a class, because the LA River has a history of biodiversity destruction that is amazing, and there are efforts being done to save it. And there are things that we can do with our money, with our voting power, in order to save the LA River or restore different parts of the LA River and make it a part of the city that we can actually use. It doesn't even have a non-use value at this point. It's just this big cement bowl that water flows through. But things can be done in order to make it an attractive area for people to visit and want to preserve. All right, so as individuals, this is a list of things that we can do, and this list is by far not exhaustive of the actions that you can take. So, are you willing to use your money to buy recycled products? And sometimes, that can be more difficult when finances are an issue. We're getting to the end of this chapter. Here are some questions for you to focus on. And that brings us to the complete end of chapter 10. And here is a superhero, Captain Planet, that was a hero from a TV show we had when we were kids. And he was out there saving the planet and focusing on ecological issues. I'm not sure if you've seen him before, but there he is, Captain Planet. All right, thank you for participating.